You already know the wheel is overrated. You know it showed up 200,000 years too late, got rejected by entire empires, and disappeared from the Middle East for 1,500 years because a camel did the job better. So here is the part that should not surprise you and somehow still will. The single most obvious application of the wheel in the modern world, strapping it to a box so a human being does not have to carry that box, took humanity until 1972 to figure out. Not 1972 BCE, not the early industrial era, 1972. The same year the first email was sent between two computers. The same decade humans had already walked on the moon 3 times. Astronauts had rolled a lunar buggy across the surface of another world 4 years before anyone thought to put reliable wheels under a suitcase. And it gets stranger, because the idea did not require a genius. It did not require new materials, new physics, or some breakthrough in engineering. It required precisely 2 wheels, a strap, and someone willing to try it. That is the entire invention. A child could sketch the concept on a napkin. And yet, for the better part of a century, in an era of jet engines, television broadcasts, and men walking on the moon, otherwise intelligent adults stood in airports, red-faced, sweating, hauling suitcases by hand, because putting wheels on that suitcase was, and this is the actual reason, considered embarrassing. Not impossible, not expensive, embarrassing. This is the story of the wheeled suitcase. And it might be the clearest example in modern history of a superior technology being blocked for decades by nothing but pride. Picture an airport terminal in the late 1960s. Business travelers move through the concourse, dressed the way you'd expect for the era. Suits, ties, polished shoes, and every single one of them is listing to one side. Not from injury, from luggage. A single overnight bag in that period could weigh 20 or 30 pounds once you added a change of clothes, shaving kit, and the heavy metal-framed construction that suitcases were built with at the time. Multiply that by 2 bags, which most travelers carried, and you had grown men and women switching hands every few dozen steps, setting bags down to flex cramping fingers, arriving at their gate with red welts across their palms and sweat through their shirts before they had even boarded a plane. Airports were getting bigger too, which made the problem worse every single year. In the 1950s, jet travel had started replacing propeller planes, and passenger numbers were climbing fast. New terminals sprawled across far more real estate than the old airfields ever had. A traveler in the 1940s might walk 200 feet from a taxi stand to a small departure hall. A traveler in 1968 might walk a quarter mile down a single concourse just to reach their gate, and then walk it again on the other end to find a taxi or a rental car counter. Longer terminals, longer walks, and heavier suitcases, all arriving at the same moment in history, and nobody had thought to connect the obvious dots. Because here's the thing that makes this story different from the window tax or the hookless fastener. This was not a case of the technology being unavailable. Humans had been putting wheels on heavy objects for roughly 5,000 years by this point. Wagons, carts, hand trucks, dollies, luggage carriers at train stations, all of it existed, all of it worked, and all of it was sitting in plain view of anyone who ever struggled through an airport with a suitcase in each hand. The wheel was not the missing piece. The missing piece was permission. An unspoken cultural agreement that this simple, obvious fix was somehow beneath serious travelers. To understand why, you have to go back further, to the era before the airport, when moving your belongings across long distances was never supposed to be something you did yourself in the first place. For most of the 19th century, if you were wealthy enough to travel internationally, you did not carry your own luggage. You didn't even consider it. Travel in that era meant the steamer trunk, an enormous reinforced box built from wood, iron, and leather, sometimes weighing over 100 pounds empty, designed to survive weeks in the hold of a ship crossing the Atlantic. These trunks were not meant to be lifted by their owners. They were meant to be lifted by other people. Porters at train stations, stewards on ocean liners, hired hands at hotels, an entire invisible workforce whose job was to haul the physical weight of other people's belongings so the traveler never had to. That workforce had a name almost everyone recognized: the porter, the red cap, the man in uniform standing at the platform edge who took your trunk from your hand the moment you stepped off a train and did not give it back until it appeared, as if by magic, in your hotel room. Wealthy travelers in this era measured their status partly by how little physical effort travel required of them. If you were carrying your own bags, something had gone wrong. You had either failed to hire enough help or you could not afford to. This is worth sitting with for a second, because it is the seed of everything that follows. From the very beginning of modern travel, there was a direct, unspoken link between how much physical struggle your luggage caused you and how much money and status you had. The rich did not carry bags, the poor did. And when the suitcase eventually replaced the trunk, that link did not disappear. It just went looking for a new place to live. The suitcase itself is a surprisingly recent invention, younger than you'd probably guess. As mass tourism and rail travel expanded in the late 1800s, ordinary middle-class families started needing something lighter and more personal than a steamer trunk, something sized to hold a suit rather than an entire household's worth of belongings. Hence the name, quite literally, a case for your suit. Early suitcases were still built heavy, still made from wood and leather and steel reinforcement, because durability mattered more than convenience in an era when baggage got thrown, dropped, and stacked by hand at every stage of a journey. By the 1930s, manufacturers were experimenting with lighter materials, vulcanized fiberboard, early plastics, and the suitcase slimmed down. But one feature never changed across all of these decades of redesign. You picked it up, you carried it. That was simply what a suitcase was. And for a surprisingly long stretch of the 20th century, nobody publicly challenged that assumption in any way that stuck. Not because nobody thought of wheels. As you're about to find out, more than one person thought of it, built it, and tried to sell it. The idea kept surfacing again and again, decades apart, invented independently by people who had no idea anyone else had already tried and failed. And every single time, it landed with a thud. The first known attempt at solving this problem on paper came in 1887, when a patent appeared for a wheeled trunk, a heavy travel case with small metal wheels built directly into the wooden base. It went nowhere. Another patent followed in 1921, filed by a man named Theophilus Houkinen for what he called an improved valise, featuring a wheel mounted on one side so the bag could be tilted and rolled rather than carried flat. That went nowhere too. A wheeled suitcase patent appeared again in 1945. Still nothing. Three separate inventors, working decades apart, all arriving independently at the same simple idea, and all three watching it disappear without a trace. Here's the detail that should stop you cold. This wasn't one stubborn industry ignoring one lone inventor. This was the same rejected idea, reinvented from scratch at least 4 separate times across more than 80 years by people who had never met each other and had no reason to know the others had already failed. Each one assumed they were the first to think of it. Each one was wrong, and each one ran into the exact same wall. That wall had nothing to do with engineering. Nobody needed to prove a wheel could hold up a suitcase. Wheels had been holding up wagons loaded with grain and iron for thousands of years. The wall was cultural, and it was about to get a face. A very specific, very determined face. A woman rolling her own homemade luggage across 2 different continents, decades before anyone in the industry would admit she was right. Block 2/8. Her name was Anita Willits Burnham, and in 1928 she did something that the entire luggage industry would spend another 44 years pretending was impossible. She was an American artist, and along with her husband Alfred and their 6 children, she was in the middle of leading her family on a round-the-world tour on what she openly called a serious budget. 6 children, a shoestring budget, multiple continents. If anyone on Earth in 1928 needed a lighter way to move luggage, it was this family. So her son, a teenager nicknamed Bud, built her one. He took 2 wheels off an old baby carriage, bolted them to one end of a trunk, and rigged a telescoping wooden handle on the other end so his mother could tilt the case back and pull it behind her like a cart. It worked. It actually worked. Anita rolled that homemade trunk through train stations, down cobblestone streets, across entire countries, for years, on 2 separate world tours. She even wrote about it in her travelogue, published in 1933, describing the moment she first pulled the case behind her with something close to triumph. Force of habit and a sense of humor, she wrote, made it work beautifully. Here's the detail that tells you everything you need to know about where this story is headed. Her own husband hated it. Alfred Burnham refused to use the rolling trunk himself. He preferred to carry his own suitcase by hand, what Anita described as his good-looking ton of bricks. And when he saw his wife and son rolling their homemade contraption through a station, he reportedly looked at them with what she called a superior eye and said, and I'm going to leave this close to verbatim because the sentiment matters more than the exact wording, that wheels belonged on suitcases about as much as wheels belonged in your head. Read that again. A man standing next to a solution that was visibly, obviously working, that his own wife had used successfully across 2 continents, chose instead to keep hauling a heavy case by hand rather than be seen rolling one. Not because the rolling trunk failed, because rolling a trunk in his mind made you look foolish. Effortless travel was for women, for artists, for eccentrics. A serious man carried his own weight, literally, and the fact that carrying it was harder was not a bug. It was the entire point. Struggle was the proof that you were doing it right. That single household argument, decades before anyone in the industry took the idea seriously, contains almost the entire explanation for why wheeled luggage took another half-century to catch on. It was never a technical problem. It was a status problem wearing an engineering costume. And Anita Willits Burnham was not an isolated eccentric who got lucky with a garage project. The idea kept resurfacing every decade or so, almost like it was trying to force its way into the world no matter how many times it got pushed back out. In 1949, Bloomingdale's, the New York department store, briefly sold a novelty attachment, a small wheeled platform you could strap onto the bottom of an existing suitcase to convert it into a rolling one. It was marketed almost as a curiosity, a gadget for the unusually lazy or the unusually practical, depending on who you asked. It did not sell in meaningful numbers, and it quietly disappeared from Bloomingdale's shelves within a year or 2, filed away in the same drawer of American retail history as pet rocks and electric hairbrushes. Then, in 1958, the idea found its most articulate champion yet, and its most instructive rejection. A man named Sam Bloom, working in the American luggage industry, built a full-scale working model of a suitcase mounted on a rolling platform with a caster wheel base and a pull handle. This was not a napkin sketch. This was not a jury-rigged baby carriage wheel bolted onto a trunk by a teenager. This was a finished, presentable prototype, built by someone who understood the luggage business from the inside, designed specifically to be pitched to the industry as a legitimate commercial product. Bloom took his model directly to the chairman of the board at Atlantic, one of the largest luggage manufacturers operating in America at the time. He set it down. He rolled it across the floor to demonstrate exactly how effortlessly it moved. And the chairman, according to the story that has been passed down through decades of luggage industry retellings, looked at the wheeled prototype, looked back at Bloom, and asked a single dismissive question: who'd want to put luggage on wheels? That sentence is worth sitting with, because it was not a stupid question from a stupid man. Whoever held that chairmanship in 1958 had almost certainly built a successful career in an industry where the entire value proposition was durability, craftsmanship, leather, brass fittings, hand-stitched corners, the kind of suitcase you inherited from your father and handed down to your son. To that executive, a suitcase on wheels did not look like an improvement. It looked like a toy. It looked like the kind of gadget you'd find in a novelty catalog next to the electric letter opener. Cute, maybe even clever, but fundamentally not what serious travelers, meaning serious men, were buying. And notice something else buried in that rejection. The chairman didn't ask whether it worked. He didn't ask about the engineering, the weight capacity, the durability of the caster wheels, or the cost of manufacturing. He asked who would want it, which is a question about identity, not function. It is the exact same question, dressed up in a boardroom instead of a train station, that Alfred Burnham had already answered 30 years earlier with his own suitcase full of bricks. The wheeled suitcase kept failing to launch, not because it didn't work, but because the people with the power to manufacture and sell it could not picture themselves, or their customers, wanting to be seen using it. Bloom's prototype went back into storage. Atlantic passed. The industry moved on, and for another decade, travelers kept switching a heavy suitcase from hand to hand down endless airport concourses, sweating through their shirts, developing calluses, because the alternative, apparently, was worse. The alternative was looking weak. But here is what makes the late 1950s and 1960s the exact moment this story was about to break wide open, whether the industry wanted it to or not. Commercial air travel was exploding. In the years right after World War II, flying had still been a rare, expensive luxury, something a small sliver of businessmen and the wealthy did occasionally. By the late 1950s, the jet age had arrived. Boeing 707 entered commercial service in 1958, the same year Sam Bloom got laughed out of a boardroom, and jet engines meant faster flights, more routes, and airlines racing to fill more seats than ever before. Airports that had been modest regional airfields a decade earlier were now sprawling multi-terminal complexes built to handle passenger volumes nobody had planned for a generation prior. And crucially, the type of person getting on those planes was changing too. Business travel exploded through the 1960s as companies expanded regional and national operations and sent employees flying constantly for meetings, sales calls, and conferences. Air travel was no longer an occasional event for a wealthy few. It was becoming a routine, exhausting, weekly grind for an enormous and growing population of ordinary working professionals, the exact population that would eventually have the least patience in the world for a design flaw everyone had simply learned to live with. At the same time, something else was shifting that the old guard of the luggage industry had almost completely failed to notice. Women were increasingly traveling alone, for business and for leisure, without a husband or a porter standing by to carry their bags for them. That single demographic shift quietly demolished one of the oldest assumptions baked into the entire resistance to wheeled luggage. The assumption, spoken out loud decades later almost word for word, that women traveling with heavy suitcases would simply have a man nearby to lift them. If there was no man nearby, if the traveler was a woman flying solo to a sales conference in Chicago, or a female executive catching a red-eye to Los Angeles, that assumption evaporated instantly. The suitcase still weighed 30 pounds. Nobody was coming to carry it for her. So by the middle of the 1960s, all of the ingredients were sitting in place. Larger, more crowded, more sprawling airports, a rapidly growing population of frequent business travelers with sore hands and cramped fingers, an increasing number of women flying without a built-in porter, and a piece of technology, wheels on a box, that had already been invented, patented, prototyped, and quietly rejected at least half a dozen separate times, going all the way back to the 1880s. All that was missing was one more attempt, made by exactly the wrong person to take no for an answer, at exactly the right moment for the industry to finally stop laughing. And in 1970, in an airport in Puerto Rico, hauling 2 overstuffed suitcases through customs after a family vacation gone slightly over budget on baggage, that man was about to have his own eureka moment. He would not build a baby carriage trunk in a garage for his own private use. He would not get quietly laughed out of a boardroom and give up. He was going to file a patent, fight for it, and force an entire industry to finally take the idea seriously, whether Macy's wanted to sell it or not. His name was Bernard Sadow, and in 1970 he was the vice president of a Massachusetts company called U.S. Luggage, which mostly manufactured suitcases and coats. He was, in other words, exactly the kind of insider the industry would eventually have to listen to. Not an outside eccentric with a baby carriage wheel, not a lone engineer building a prototype nobody asked for, but a career executive inside the very business that had spent decades rejecting this idea. The story of his invention has been told and retold so many times it has taken on the polish of a folktale, but the core of it holds up. Sadow had just returned from a family vacation in Aruba with his wife, and the trip home involved the kind of ordeal that any air traveler from that era would recognize instantly. 2 heavy suitcases, each around 27 inches, hauled by hand through a long customs line at the airport in Puerto Rico on the connecting leg home. His arms ached, his hands were raw, and somewhere in that customs hall, standing in line, shifting a suitcase from one aching hand to the other, he noticed an airport worker nearby moving a heavy piece of machinery across the floor with almost no effort at all, simply by rolling it along on a wheeled skid. Sadow stood there, watching a man effortlessly glide hundreds of pounds of equipment across the floor, while he himself sweated under 60 pounds of clothes and souvenirs, and the connection landed with the force of the obvious. He turned to his wife, according to his own retelling of the story, and said something to the effect of, "That is exactly what luggage needs, wheels." It is worth pausing here because this is the 4th or 5th time in this story that someone independently arrived at precisely the same insight, decades apart, with no knowledge that anyone had tried it before. The idea was never rare. The idea was, if anything, almost embarrassingly obvious, sitting in plain sight in front of anyone who had ever struggled with heavy luggage, next to literally any other wheeled object on Earth. What was rare was someone with the institutional standing, the stubbornness, and the timing to actually push it through. When Sadow got home, he did not build an elaborate new mechanism. He went straight to a piece of furniture in his own house, a wardrobe trunk fitted with small casters for moving it around a room, unscrewed 4 of those wheels, and bolted them directly onto the bottom of a suitcase. He attached a strap to one end. He tested it in his own living room, pulling the suitcase around behind him on its new wheels, and it rolled. That was the entire prototype, 4 furniture casters and a strap. He filed for a U.S. patent in February of 1970, titling the invention simply Rolling Luggage. And in the patent application itself, Sadow made a claim that reads almost like a mission statement for this entire story. He wrote, in language that sounds more like a manifesto than typical patent boilerplate, that baggage handling had become perhaps the single biggest difficulty encountered by an air passenger. Not a minor inconvenience, not a nice-to-have improvement, the biggest single difficulty. He believed, correctly as it turned out, that he was solving one of the defining frustrations of modern travel, and he built his entire pitch around that conviction. The patent, numbered 3,653,474, was formally granted on April 4th, 1972, 2 full years after he filed it. But Sadow did not wait around for the government paperwork to catch up before trying to sell the idea. Armed with his four-wheeled prototype, he started making the rounds of major New York City department stores, pitching wheeled luggage directly to buyers who could put it on shelves and move real volume. And here, almost exactly like Sam Bloom 12 years earlier, he ran straight into the same wall. Store after store turned him down. And when Sadow later described the reasons, he did not describe skepticism about the mechanism, whether the wheels would hold up, whether the strap would tear, whether the design would survive a baggage handler throwing it into a cargo hold. Nobody was worried about the engineering. What buyers told him, according to Sadow's own account, was that the entire idea ran into what he called a macho feeling among male shoppers, a deep, unspoken assumption that a man rolling a suitcase on wheels would look wimpy, weak, somehow less than a man who carried his bags the hard way. And beyond that, buyers assumed that women who traveled would simply have a husband nearby to lift their bags for them anyway. So who exactly was this product even for? Read that sentence again, because it is, almost word for word, the same objection Alfred Burnham made to his own wife's rolling trunk in 1928, and the same dismissive question the Atlantic chairman asked Sam Bloom in 1958. 42 years, 3 separate moments, 3 different men in 3 completely different contexts, and the exact same underlying fear surfacing every single time. Not, will this work? Will this make me look weak? Sadow kept pitching anyway. He was turned away by a buyer at Macy's named Jack Schwartz, who apparently saw no future in the product. But Sadow did not stop there, and this is the detail that separates his attempt from every failed attempt before it. He got a second meeting, this time with a Macy's vice president named Jerry Levy, who looked at the same wheeled suitcase Jack Schwartz had dismissed and saw something different. Not a novelty, but an actual solution to an actual problem that every single one of Macy's customers dealt with every time they flew anywhere. Macy's agreed to stock it. And when the wheeled suitcase finally reached store shelves starting in 1970, the marketing department gave it a tagline that, in hindsight, sounds almost like an apology for how long this had taken. They called it the luggage that glides. For the first time in this entire 80-year history of rejected patents and mocked prototypes and dismissive department store chairmen, a wheeled suitcase was sitting on a shelf in one of the largest retail stores in America, being actively promoted to the public. This should have been the moment everything changed overnight. It was not. Because Sadow's design, for all its historical importance, was genuinely flawed in a way that gave the skeptics fresh ammunition. His suitcase sat flat on the ground, towed behind the traveler on a long strap, exactly the way you might walk a dog. 4 small caster wheels supported the full horizontal weight of the case, and dragging it behind you at that low angle meant it had an unfortunate habit of tipping over sideways the moment it hit an uneven bit of pavement or a slight curve in your walking path. And because the case trailed behind you on a loose strap rather than staying tucked neatly at your side, it had an equally unfortunate habit of clipping the back of your own ankles with every few steps. A small, repetitive, faintly humiliating collision that undercut the entire promise of effortless travel. So the product that finally broke the 80-year curse of rejected wheeled luggage did not become an overnight sensation. It sold. It found a real audience of travelers who were happy to trade a little ankle bruising for the alternative of carrying 60 pounds by hand through an airport. But it remained for most of the 1970s a secondary option, something travelers might choose, but rarely something that replaced the traditional hand-carried suitcase as the default. By 1974, Sadow's patent protection had effectively been broken, with competitors producing their own versions of the same basic, four-wheeled, flat-toed design, which tells you 2 things at once. The market had finally accepted that wheeled luggage was a real, legitimate, sellable product, and yet nobody had actually solved the underlying design problem that made the experience of using one still faintly awkward. If you're the kind of person who enjoys finding out that the most obvious ideas in human history took the longest to arrive, this channel exists entirely for stories like this one. So go ahead and hit subscribe, because what happens next in this story involves an airline pilot, a garage in Florida, and a single design change so simple it makes Sadow's entire invention look like a rough draft. Because here's the thing nobody in the luggage industry wanted to admit through the rest of that decade. Sadow had broken the curse. He had proven, at last, that wheeled luggage could actually sell in real department stores to real customers. But he had not built the version of wheeled luggage that would eventually make an entire century of skepticism look absurd. That version was still sitting more than 15 years in the future, and it would not come from inside the luggage industry at all. It would come from someone who spent his entire career watching up close exactly how badly the existing system was failing the people who traveled more than anyone else on Earth. Block 4/8. Through the rest of the 1970s, Sadow's flat, dog-walked, ankle-clipping design remained the standard, if you could even call it a standard, since most travelers still chose to carry their bags by hand rather than deal with a suitcase that tipped over on its side every time you turned a corner. But there was one group of travelers who could not afford to be picky about their luggage, because they were not traveling once a year for a family vacation. They were traveling every single week, sometimes every single day, and every design flaw that an ordinary tourist could shrug off, they had to live with, over and over, for their entire career. Airline flight crews. Think about what a pilot's or flight attendant's job actually demands of their luggage. They are not checking bags into a cargo hold like passengers do. They are walking briskly through crowded terminals on tight layover schedules, navigating jet bridges, moving quickly between gates, standing for long stretches in galleys, and doing all of it multiple times a day for years, often in heels or dress shoes that were never designed for hauling 60 pounds of gear. A crew member's suitcase was not a once-a-year inconvenience. It was a piece of equipment they depended on every single working day of their professional life, and by the mid-1980s, an enormous number of them were fed up. One of those crew members was a Northwest Airlines pilot named Robert Plath. Like Sadow before him, Plath was not a professional inventor chasing a patent for its own sake. He was someone living inside the exact problem he eventually solved, watching flight crews around him drag heavy, awkward bags through terminal after terminal, and thinking, the same way Sadow had thought standing in that customs line in Puerto Rico, that there had to be a better way. Plath's insight was not to invent wheels on a suitcase. That had already been done, repeatedly, for nearly a century. His insight was to completely rethink the orientation of the entire object. Instead of a flat case towed behind you at ankle height on a long strap, Plath designed a suitcase built to stand upright, tall and narrow, mounted on two wheels at the base, with a telescoping handle that extended out of the top of the case itself. No separate strap required. You pulled the handle up, the case rose to stand vertically beside you, and you rolled it along at your side rather than dragging it behind you like an unruly pet. The difference sounds small on paper. In practice, it solved every single problem that had kept wheeled luggage a secondary option for the previous 15 years. A vertical case, towed at your side, does not tip over sideways when you turn a corner, because its center of gravity sits directly above its two wheels rather than trailing awkwardly behind you at the end of a strap. It does not clip your ankles because it travels beside you rather than chasing your heels. And the telescoping handle meant you were no longer bent slightly forward, gripping a strap like a leash. You stood upright, walked at a normal pace, and the suitcase simply kept up. Plath built the first working version of this design in his own garage in Boca Raton, Florida, sometime around 1987. He called it the Rollerboard, and true to the pattern of nearly every genuine innovation in this story, he did not build it for the mass market first. He built it because he needed it himself, and he gave early versions to fellow pilots and flight attendants at Northwest Airlines, the exact population that had been quietly suffering through the worst version of this problem for their entire careers. The response inside that small circle was immediate and almost unanimous. Crew members who tried Plath's upright two-wheel design did not go back to their old bags. Word spread through crew lounges and layover hotels the way genuinely useful inventions always spread among people who actually depend on their equipment. Not through advertising, but through one coworker seeing another coworker's bag and asking, almost involuntarily, "Where did you get that?" And this is where the story of the wheeled suitcase finally breaks free from the 80-year cycle of rejection. And the reason has almost nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with who was doing the rolling. Because remember the objection that had sunk this idea again and again, going all the way back to Alfred Burnham's sneer at his own wife in 1928, echoed by the Atlantic chairman in 1958, echoed again by department store buyers who turned Sadow away in the early 1970s. The fear was never that wheeled luggage wouldn't work. The fear was that using it would make you look weak, unserious, somehow diminished in the eyes of other travelers. Now picture the exact person disproving that fear day after day in the most visible, most authoritative setting imaginable. A commercial airline pilot in full uniform, captain's stripes on the shoulder, striding confidently through a crowded terminal, pulling a rollerboard effortlessly at his side. Nobody looking at that image thought weak. Nobody thought wimpy. They thought, that man clearly knows exactly what he is doing, because he does this every single day, and he has chosen the smartest possible way to do it. That is the exact mechanism by which decades of stigma finally collapsed. Not through advertising, not through a marketing campaign built around convincing men that wheels were manly, but through the simple, repeated, public visibility of the most competent, most frequent travelers on Earth using the product constantly, confidently, and without a hint of self-consciousness. If a fighter jet trained commercial pilot rolled his luggage through the airport, the entire cultural argument that rolling luggage was for the weak simply evaporated. You cannot call something wimpy when the person doing it is the one flying the plane. The timing could not have worked out better if Plath had planned it himself, though he had not. Commercial air travel in the United States was in the middle of an enormous structural shift. The Airline Deregulation Act had passed in 1978, stripping away decades of government control over airline routes and fares, and the result was an explosion in air travel volume through the 1980s, as airlines competed aggressively on price and expanded their networks. More routes meant more flights. More flights meant more flight crews on the ground at any given moment, moving briskly through terminals, in front of an ever-growing population of ordinary business travelers who were themselves flying more often than any previous generation in history. Every single one of those ordinary travelers, standing at a gate, watching a flight crew glide past with their new upright bags, while everyone else struggled with heavy hand-carried suitcases or Sadow's older tip-prone design, was absorbing a small, quiet lesson about what serious, professional travel was supposed to look like. And they started asking crew members directly where they could buy one. Plath saw the demand building around him and made the decision that turned a garage project into an entire company. He began manufacturing rollerboards to sell directly, first informally to fellow pilots and flight attendants who kept asking, then to a slowly widening circle of frequent business travelers who had seen the bags in action and wanted the same thing. By 1989, demand had grown to the point that Plath could no longer keep up with orders out of his own garage, and he moved production into an actual warehouse. In 1991, he made the leap official, retiring from his career as a commercial pilot to run his new company, Travel Pro, full-time, turning what had started as a personal fix for his own aching shoulders into a full-scale luggage manufacturer. If you're enjoying finding out how something you use without thinking twice was once considered a professional liability, that is exactly the kind of story this channel digs up every week. So consider subscribing, because the next stretch of this story is where a single design decision quietly reshaped the physical architecture of every airplane built for the following 3 decades. Because as the rollerboard spread from crew lounges into the hands of ordinary passengers throughout the early 1990s, it created a problem nobody in the aviation industry had anticipated, and it was not a small one. Airplane overhead storage bins, designed for an earlier generation of soft-sided garment bags and flat suitcases, were suddenly being asked to accommodate a completely different shape of luggage: tall, rigid, rectangular, upright cases that did not fit the shallow, curved bins installed on most commercial aircraft. Airlines and aircraft manufacturers found themselves redesigning cabin storage specifications almost entirely around the dimensions of a suitcase invented in a Florida garage by a pilot who just wanted to stop hurting his shoulder on layovers. Think about the scale of that ripple effect for a second. One person's private frustration, solved with a 2-wheeled prototype nobody outside a small circle of coworkers had ever heard of, ended up quietly rewriting the interior architecture of the modern airplane cabin. That is not a small footnote in the history of travel. That is the physical structure of nearly every commercial aircraft built after the early 1990s, bent permanently around the shape of a suitcase that the industry had spent an entire century insisting nobody would ever want. By the early 1990s, the wheeled suitcase had crossed a threshold that Anita Willits-Burnham's husband, Sam Bloom's chairman, and the Macy's buyer who turned Sadow away could never have predicted. It was no longer a curiosity for the unusually practical. It was becoming the default, and the shift happened faster than almost anyone in the industry anticipated. Because once the stigma broke, it broke completely. Airports in the early 1990s started to look visibly different from the airports of a decade earlier, where a 1985 terminal photograph shows travelers gripping suitcase handles at their sides, arms slightly bent, shoulders uneven from the weight. A 1995 photograph shows something closer to what you'd recognize today. Travelers upright, walking briskly, one hand resting lightly on a telescoping handle, luggage trailing effortlessly at their side like an obedient pet rather than a burden. Business travelers who had watched flight crews glide through terminals for years finally stopped asking whether they should switch and simply switched. Frequent flyer culture, which had exploded through the deregulated 1980s, became the single loudest advocate for wheeled luggage that the industry had ever had, not through any advertisement, but through pure, repeated visibility. The same mechanism that had broken the stigma among crew members years earlier, now working its way through the entire traveling public. And here's a detail that puts the whole 80-year delay in perspective. This was not actually the first attempt at solving the problem outside of Sadow's American patent. Across the Atlantic, a British company called Portable Porter had been quietly trying the exact same idea more than a decade before Sadow ever stepped off that flight in Puerto Rico. In 1963, Portable Porter introduced a suitcase called the Rolly Case, with a pair of wheels mounted on one bottom corner and a handle positioned near the opposite top corner so a traveler could tip the case onto its wheeled edge and pull it along the ground. It cost about 4 guineas, a small fraction of what a Samsonite suitcase cost at the time, and by any reasonable measure, it should have been an easy sell. It was cheap, it worked, it solved a real problem. It barely sold. And when a Times correspondent wrote about the Rolly case in 1965, trying to explain who exactly this product was for, the verdict was almost identical to everything you've already heard in this story, delivered with the same casual certainty. The case, the correspondent predicted, would appeal mainly to women buyers, not business travelers, not men, women. As if the entire category of dragging your own belongings through a train station rather than lifting them was by its very nature something beneath serious male travelers. The Rolly case stayed on English shelves until roughly 1968, and then quietly vanished. Another entry on the long list of perfectly functional wheeled suitcases that died because of who the market assumed would be caught using one. Even after Sadow's American patent broke the ice in the early 1970s, other engineers kept independently circling the same basic problem and inventing their own clever variations nobody had asked for. In 1972, the very same year Sadow's patent was finally granted, a pair of Danish inventors named Helga Helene Fogh and Hans Thomas Thomsen patented a suitcase for a company called Cavalet with a genuinely elegant solution to an annoying flaw. Their design used retractable wheels that folded up flush into the bottom of the case when you weren't rolling it, along with a retractable handle on one side, so the suitcase looked and behaved like a completely ordinary case the moment you needed to set it down, lift it into an overhead rack, or stack it in a car trunk. It was, in terms of pure engineering elegance, arguably ahead of anything Sadow or Samsonite were making at the time. It did not become the industry standard. Delsey tried something similar in 1975 with a molded plastic case featuring a recessed pocket for the wheels, also not the standard. The pattern by now should feel familiar. Good engineering was never the bottleneck. The bottleneck was always cultural permission, and that permission, once flight crews and frequent business travelers finally granted it in the late 1980s and early 1990s, spread with a speed that made the previous century of rejection look almost comically stubborn by comparison. Within a handful of years, wheeled luggage went from something crew members used and ordinary travelers eyed with curiosity to something almost nobody thought twice about at all. That shift did not stop at adult luggage. It kept spreading, and it found its way into a completely unexpected battleground: elementary school hallways. Through the 1990s, as wheeled suitcases became the norm for air travel, manufacturers noticed an obvious adjacent market: children's school backpacks. Kids were hauling textbooks, binders, and gym clothes on their backs every single day, and pediatricians and orthopedic specialists had spent years warning that overloaded backpacks were straining developing spines. The solution seemed obvious, the exact same solution that had just conquered the airport: put wheels on it. Wheeled backpacks flooded the market by the late 1990s, marketed directly to parents worried about their kids' posture. And then something happened that this entire story had trained you to expect, but that nobody in the backpack industry saw coming. Schools started banning them. Not because they didn't work, because in crowded hallways between classes, a wheeled backpack rolling behind a student became a genuine tripping hazard for everyone walking behind them, catching ankles, blocking narrow stairwells, and creating exactly the kind of chaos that a school administrator trying to move 800 students between periods in 4 minutes could not tolerate. Districts across the United States and the United Kingdom issued outright bans on wheeled backpacks through the 2000s, sending kids back to shoulder straps and creating one of the only cases in this entire story where wheeled luggage was rejected for a completely legitimate, purely practical reason rather than a status anxiety dressed up as common sense. It is almost refreshing, honestly, after 80 years of rejection rooted in nothing but pride, to find one rejection rooted in something as simple as hallway traffic flow. Back in the adult market, the industry kept refining the design nobody had wanted a generation earlier. Robert Plath's two-wheeled, upright rollaboard configuration dominated the 1990s completely, becoming so standard that airlines began building overhead bin dimensions specifically around its proportions. But the luggage industry, having finally accepted that wheels were not just acceptable, but essential, kept pushing the concept further, chasing the exact same instinct that had driven every inventor in this story from Sadow to Plath, the belief that moving your own luggage should require as close to zero physical effort as humanly possible. Samsonite, the company that had itself only patented its first wheeled suitcase back in 1974, more than 2 years after Sadow, introduced something in 1997 called the Ultra Transporter, the first upright case built around a four-wheel system rather than two. 3 years later, in 2000, Samsonite pushed the idea to its logical conclusion and launched the Spinner, a suitcase with 4 wheels mounted flush against the base, each one capable of rotating a full 360 degrees independently. Instead of tilting the case back onto 2 wheels and towing it behind you the way Plath's rollerboard required, you could push a Spinner suitcase directly beside you, upright at arm's length, steering it in any direction with a single fingertip, gliding it sideways through a crowded gate, or spinning it a full turn to squeeze past another traveler without ever tilting the bag or bracing against its weight. It took another few years for the 4-wheel format to fully mature, with Samsonite's dedicated Sahara Spinner line arriving in 2004 as the format most travelers today would immediately recognize. But by the mid-2000s, the argument that had once consumed department store boardrooms and family arguments alike, whether a wheeled suitcase made you look weak, had become so thoroughly extinct that the only debate left in the entire luggage industry was a purely technical one, whether 2 wheels or 4 wheels rolled better through a crowded airport. Nobody was asking who would want to put luggage on wheels anymore. Everybody wanted it. The only question left was how many wheels. Block 6/8. Step back for a moment and look at what actually delayed this invention, because it is genuinely one of the strangest case studies in this entire channel's history of tracking why simple ideas take absurdly long to arrive. Compare it to the wheel itself, the one you already know the full story of. The Inca rejected the wheel for a specific, defensible, physical reason. Their roads climbed sheer mountain cliffs on stone staircases, crossed rope bridges that would snap under a loaded axle, and a cart would have rolled backward into a valley on any slope steeper than a gentle grade. That was engineering logic. A llama could climb terrain a wheeled cart never could. Rejecting the wheel in the Andes was not stubbornness, it was correct. Now compare that to the suitcase. There was no mountain. There was no rope bridge. There was no terrain where a wheeled suitcase performed worse than a hand-carried one. Airport floors are flat. Train station platforms are flat. City sidewalks, for the most part, are flat. Every single argument against wheeled luggage across nearly a century of rejection, from the 1887 patent nobody bought to Anita Willits Burnham's husband sneering at his own wife's invention in 1928, to the Atlantic chairman asking who'd want it in 1958, to the macho-feeling department store buyers described to Sadow in 1970, to the Times correspondent in 1965, assuming only women would want the rolly case, was never about whether the thing worked. It was about who might be seen using it and what that would say about them. This is the detail worth sitting with, because it reframes the entire 80-year gap. The wheel and the suitcase both got delayed by roughly a century relative to when the underlying technology first became available. But the wheel's delay in one part of the world came from physics. The suitcase's delay came almost entirely from a single fragile idea about masculinity, an idea so powerful that it survived unchanged across more than 4 generations of American and European culture, from the Roaring '20s all the way through the Reagan era, without a single meaningful engineering objection ever standing in its way. And once you notice that pattern here, you start noticing it everywhere else in the history of everyday objects. Because this channel has now told versions of this exact same story more than once. Remember the button versus the zipper, and how it took 2 world wars before the fastest, most obvious closure mechanism finally displaced the slower one? Not because buttons worked better, but because an entire industry trusted tradition over speed until a war forced the issue by sheer scale. Remember the elevator, and how hotels in the 1860s had to offer discounted rates on upper floors because guests were too afraid of the new machine to ride it, even after the safety mechanism had been publicly demonstrated with a man standing on a platform while his own assistant cut the rope in front of a crowd. Fear, pride, tradition, and status anxiety have derailed obviously superior technology again and again throughout this channel's entire back catalog. And the wheeled suitcase might be the single clearest, cleanest example of all of them. Because unlike a zipper or an elevator, there was never even a legitimate mechanical failure mode to point to. There was no rope that snapped. There was no fabric that tore. There was only a suitcase, rolling perfectly well, that a certain kind of man refused to be seen pulling. Historians who study the diffusion of household technology have documented a strikingly similar pattern in a completely different domain: domestic labor-saving devices in the early 20th century. The washing machine, the vacuum cleaner, and the electric iron all promised, quite literally, to remove physical labor from people's lives. The exact same promise a wheeled suitcase makes to a traveler's arms and shoulders. And yet adoption of many of these devices in wealthier households was slower than manufacturers expected, in part because visible physical effort had become, in certain social circles, its own kind of status marker, proof that a household could afford servants to do the hardest labor, or proof that the woman of the house was personally industrious and did not need shortcuts. Convenience, it turns out, is not always the value people are actually optimizing for. Sometimes what people are optimizing for is what convenience appears to say about them. The suitcase took that same instinct and pointed it specifically at men, and specifically at physical strength as a stand-in for competence and seriousness. A man who could carry 60 pounds of luggage without complaint was, in the unspoken logic of mid-century business travel, a man who could be trusted, a man who did not need help, a man whose body backed up his professional authority. A man rolling a suitcase behind him on a leash was, in that same unspoken logic, advertising that he could not or would not carry his own weight. A phrase that has always meant something bigger than luggage. And here is what makes the eventual collapse of that logic so satisfying to look back on. It was not defeated by an argument. It was not defeated by an advertising campaign explaining to men that wheels were, in fact, still very manly. It was defeated by the simple, repeated, undeniable image of the single most competent, most authoritative traveler in any airport, a uniformed commercial airline pilot, walking with total confidence, pulling a rollerboard at his side. You cannot argue your way out of decades of stigma. You can only outlast it with enough visible, high-status people quietly proving the stigma was empty the entire time. By the time business travelers of the 1990s were choosing their own wheeled bags, almost nobody consciously remembered why anyone had ever hesitated in the first place. Ask a business traveler in 1998 why they were rolling a suitcase instead of carrying one, and you would not get a philosophical answer about masculinity and status. You would get a shrug and a simple answer: because it's easier. That is always how these stories end. The stigma disappears so completely that within a single generation, people cannot even remember it existed. And the technology becomes so obviously correct that anyone who resisted it starts to look, in hindsight, faintly ridiculous. Exactly the way Alfred Burnham looks today, refusing to roll a working suitcase next to his own wife because he preferred to call it a ton of bricks. If you're the kind of person who finds it satisfying watching an entire century of misplaced pride quietly collapse under the weight of one confident airline pilot, this channel exists for exactly that feeling. So go ahead and hit subscribe, because the final stretch of this story is where the wheeled suitcase stops being a novelty entirely and becomes something so completely unremarkable that an entire global industry and an entire generation of travelers who never carried a suitcase by hand in their lives would have absolutely no idea any of this resistance ever happened. Because the strangest part of the wheeled suitcase's story is not that it took so long to arrive, it's how quickly, once it did arrive, it became invisible. The exact same fate that met stained glass, buttons, elevators, and every other object this channel has ever traced, from luxury or stigma into something too ordinary to notice. And the final chapter of that invisibility starts, appropriately enough, at exactly the moment global air travel exploded past anything the industry had ever planned for, and wheeled luggage stopped being a convenience and became something closer to a requirement. Look at where the wheeled suitcase actually sits today, because the scale of what grew out of 4 wheels bolted onto a wardrobe casing in 1970 is almost impossible to picture all at once. The global luggage industry, an industry that spent nearly a century actively rejecting its own most obvious product improvement, now generates somewhere in the range of $40 billion a year, and it keeps growing. Every year, travel keeps recovering and expanding. More than 4 billion airline passengers move through the world's airports annually at this point, and according to industry data from the International Air Transport Association, slightly more than half of them are choosing to travel with carry-on baggage rather than checking a bag at all, a shift that has almost nothing to do with luggage design and everything to do with money, but which quietly depends on the wheeled suitcase to function at all. Because here is a detail that ties directly back to Bernard Sadow's original patent language, his claim that baggage handling had become perhaps the single biggest difficulty facing an air passenger. Airlines discovered decades later that this difficulty could be turned into a revenue stream. Starting in the mid-2000s, as fuel costs rose and competition intensified, American and eventually international carriers began charging separate fees for checked baggage, fees that added up to nearly $7 billion in a single year for U.S. airlines alone by the early 2020s. And the moment airlines started charging $50 or $60 each way to check a bag, an entire generation of travelers made a collective, rational decision to simply stop checking bags altogether, to cram everything they needed into a single carry-on and roll it directly onto the plane themselves. That decision, multiplied across hundreds of millions of travelers every year, would have been almost unthinkable in the era of the hand-carried suitcase. Nobody was going to sprint through a connecting terminal, gripping 2 30-pound cases by their handles, arms burning, just to save a checked bag fee. The entire economics of budget air travel as it exists today, no-frills carriers competing on razor-thin margins, unbundled pricing where the base fare barely covers the seat itself, an entire industry built on travelers packing light and moving fast between gates, depends on an assumption that would have been physically absurd 50 years earlier. The assumption that an average traveler can comfortably manage their own luggage alone, quickly, without help, indefinitely. Put another way, the wheeled suitcase did not just make air travel more comfortable, it quietly became one of the load-bearing structural assumptions underneath the entire modern budget airline business model. The same way the elevator became a load-bearing assumption underneath the skyscraper, and the way the button became a load-bearing assumption underneath the entire concept of ready-made, off-the-rack clothing. Remove it, and an enormous interconnected system that nobody consciously associates with a suitcase would start to strain at the seams. And the technology kept refining itself in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to anyone standing in that customs line in Puerto Rico in 1970. Smart luggage arrived over the past decade, cases with built-in GPS trackers, so a bag lost by an airline can be located from a phone, cases with USB charging ports built into the shell, cases with biometric locks that open to a fingerprint instead of a combination. Manufacturers now build suitcases from polycarbonate blends nearly half the weight of the materials Sada was working with, engineered specifically to shave every possible gram off the empty case so travelers can pack more before hitting an airline's weight limit. None of this exists without the fundamental premise Sadao, Plath, and an unbroken chain of quietly rejected inventors going back to 1887 had all independently arrived at. That a suitcase is not just a container, it is a vehicle, and a vehicle deserves an engine, or at minimum, a set of wheels that actually work. If you're the kind of traveler who has never once thought about any of this while breezing through security with a carry-on trailing behind you, that is precisely the point of this entire story, and it is exactly the kind of forgotten history this channel goes looking for every single week. So if this is your first time here, consider subscribing before we get to the part where all of this loops back to where it truly began. Because there is one more layer to this story that deserves attention before we close the loop, and it is the layer that connects this video directly back to the one you probably already watched about the wheel itself. Remember that video's closing argument, that the wheel's true legacy was never the cart or the wagon rolling down a dirt road. It was the underlying principle, a disc rotating freely on a fixed axis. An idea so versatile, it eventually became the hidden skeleton inside gears, turbines, flywheels, pulleys, electric motors, and nearly every mechanical system humans have ever built. The wheeled suitcase is, in a strange and almost poetic way, one of the last major applications of that ancient principle to reach the general public, arriving roughly 5,000 years after a Mesopotamian potter first spun wet clay on a rotating stone disc, and arriving nearly 2 full centuries after the Industrial Revolution had already put rotating wheels inside steam engines, locomotives, and factory machinery. The gap between when the wheel and axle became mechanically trivial to manufacture, sometime in the 19th century, and when it finally got attached to something as simple and personal as a suitcase in 1970, is almost a full century all on its own. And unlike the Incas' mountain roads or the Middle East's roadless deserts, there was no terrain, no climate, no material science problem standing in the way this time. There was only a man named Alfred Burnham standing in a train station, refusing to be seen rolling anything. This brings us to the final and perhaps most uncomfortable question in this entire story. Why does any of this matter now? If we eventually got the wheels and the airports are full of rolling bags and the sore shoulders of the 1960s are a distant memory, why should we care that it took 80 years of rejection to get there? We should care because the story of the wheeled suitcase is not really about a suitcase. It is a diagnostic map of the human blind spot. It is a case study in the terrifying reality that a solution can be sitting in plain sight for an entire century, perfectly functional and desperately needed, and we will still collectively refuse to see it because it conflicts with a story we've told ourselves about who we are. Think about the sheer density of that blind spot for a second. Between the first patent in 1887 and the mass adoption of the rollerboard in the early 1990s, the human race fought two world wars. We split the atom. We mapped the human genome. We invented the transistor, the internet, and the jet engine. We mastered the physics required to hurl a pressurized tube of aluminum through the stratosphere at 500 miles per hour. But for almost the entire duration of that century of miracles, we lacked the cultural permission to put two plastic discs on the bottom of a box. This is what historians sometimes call the bottleneck of the obvious. We like to think of innovation as a straight line, a ladder where each rung leads logically to the next. But the wheeled suitcase proves that innovation is actually a landscape full of high walls and hidden doors. The most obvious ideas are often the hardest to implement because they require us to admit that the way we've been doing things for generations was not just traditional, it was fundamentally inefficient. It was, in a word, a mistake. And humans are notoriously bad at admitting that our struggle is a mistake. When Alfred Burnham looked at his wife's rolling trunk in 1928 and called it "wheels in your head," he wasn't just being a stubborn husband, he was defending a worldview. In his mind, travel was supposed to be a burden. Effort was the price of admission for seeing the world. If you removed the effort, you weren't just making travel easier, you were making it less real. We see this exact same logic surfacing in almost every major technological shift this channel has ever covered. We saw it with the elevator, where people initially viewed vertical travel as a terrifying violation of the natural order. We saw it with the transition from the camelback to the wheel in the Middle East, where a superior local solution was discarded for centuries because it didn't fit the modern image of an empire. And we see it today in the way we talk about automation, artificial intelligence, and the future of work. Every time a new technology promises to remove a layer of human struggle, we don't just ask if it works. We ask what the removal of that struggle will do to our character. We worry that the easy way is the weak way. We worry that if we stop carrying the heavy suitcase, we will forget how to be strong. The story of Bernard Sato and Robert Plath proves that this fear is almost always a hallucination. When the airline pilots started rolling their bags, they didn't become weaker pilots. They didn't lose their authority. They just stopped having back pain. They became more efficient, more capable, and more focused on the actual task of flying the plane. They proved that there is no inherent virtue in unnecessary struggle. The wheeled suitcase is the ultimate proof that the macho feeling Sadow's buyers described is the single greatest enemy of progress. Pride is a weight we carry that doesn't just slow us down, it keeps us from even noticing the wheels are available. But there's another lesson hidden in this 80-year delay, one that relates back to the very first video in this series. If you remember our deep dive into the origin of the wheel itself, we discovered that the wheel is a non-obvious invention. It doesn't exist in nature. There are no rolling animals, no biological axles. The wheel was a radical departure from the natural world, a piece of pure geometry forced onto a messy reality. The suitcase, however, was the opposite. It was a too obvious invention. Putting wheels on a heavy object is the most basic application of the wheels principle. It is the first thing a child does with a toy box, and yet it was the too obvious idea that took longer to catch on than the non-obvious one. We found it easier to build a moon rocket, a machine that defies every natural instinct we have, than to fix the suitcase, because the rocket didn't threaten anyone's sense of status. The rocket was a feat of strength. The wheeled suitcase was an admission of fatigue. This tells us something profound about where the next great innovations are likely hiding. They probably aren't in the high-tech laboratories or the multi-billion-dollar R&D departments. They are likely sitting right in front of us, in the objects we use every day, disguised as necessary struggles. They're the things we complain about while waiting in line, the pains we've learned to ignore, and the inefficiencies we've rebranded as tradition. Somewhere, right now, there is a modern-day version of the 1968 businessman, red-faced and sweating, switching a heavy bag from hand to hand while a better solution sits 2 feet away. We are all that businessman in some part of our lives. We are all carrying something heavy because we're afraid of how we'd look if we put it on wheels. If you've stuck with us through this entire 2-part journey, from the mountain roads of the Inca to the terminals of Heathrow, you've seen the wheel do more than just spin. You've seen it act as a mirror for human nature. It shows us our brilliance, our adaptability, and, in the case of the suitcase, our incredible, stubborn capacity for self-inflicted luggage. This channel was built to track these exact patterns, the invisible histories of the things we take for granted. We've looked at the button, the zipper, the elevator, and the wheel, and in every single story the conclusion is the same. Progress is not just about inventing new tools, it is about outgrowing old fears. If you want to keep exploring these blind spots with us, if you want to find out why the most obvious parts of your world took centuries to arrive, then you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because there is a whole world of suitcases with bricks out there, and we are just getting started on finding the wheels for them. The next time you're at an airport and you hear that specific rhythmic click-clack of wheels rolling over the tile floor, take a second to listen to it. That sound isn't just travel. It's the sound of a century-old argument finally being settled. It's the sound of humanity finally deciding that maybe, just maybe, it's okay to let the wheel do the work. Because the wheel showed up 5,000 years ago. But it took us until 1970 to realize it could help us with our socks and our suits. Let that be a reminder. The next revolution is probably already here. It's just waiting for someone to stop being embarrassed by it. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.